this lecture, we're looking at Stuart England and the changes in religious and political policies during the reign of James I, as it flows into the reign of Charles I. And I think for newcomers to this subject, it can always sound a bit boring. Even just the name, Stuart England, usually sounds like something we're not all too familiar with. But as we'll see, this is actually a pretty chaotic and interesting time period. And a lot of the things that we deal with even to this day have roots here in the reign of the Stuart kings. Well, who are the Stuart kings? The Stuart era roughly goes from 1603 down until 1688. In 1688, there was something called the Glorious Revolution, where the king and queen, William and Mary of Orange, the famous William and Mary, come up and take over the throne after James II is more or less kicked out. Now, in some renderings, they continue the Stuart age on for a good bit of time, but in terms of the actual lineage, it's also customary to end it at 1688, when a new dynasty comes up. Well, how do they come to the throne? Well, we have to remind ourselves that Elizabeth I was the last of the Tudors. She died in 1603, still a virgin, still unmarried. In fact, one of her great nicknames is that she is the Virgin Queen. And in modern English, whenever you see, for example, the name Virginia, whether it's the Virginia Trading Company or the state of Virginia, that actually is derived from this nickname for Elizabeth. Virginia, the Virgin Queen, etc. And trying to determine why Elizabeth never married is often a failed quest. She came to the throne at age 25. She was certainly within an age range of the day that would have meant that she could have had a succession. She could have had children had she chosen someone to marry. And there are all kinds of theories as to what happened here. One of the more popular ones is that Elizabeth, having seen the troubles brought upon Mary when she married Philip of Spain, felt that she herself wanted to rule and take the leadership for herself, and she wanted no one to question whether or not she was truly in charge. Another theory is that she was somewhat conflicted sexually. There was a situation not long after Henry's death during Edward VI, where an older man, in fact the man who married Catherine Parr, Henry's last wife, once Henry had died, was, let's just say, a bit too flirtatious. And in fact, the man actually is eventually put on trial and executed, not only for this, but also for some treasonous acts against the Lord Protector during Edward's reign. Elizabeth, still just a young girl, roughly at the age of early puberty, was really put under the hot lights and had to answer all kinds of questions about how she was treated. Some have seen in this some sort of sexual abuse, some sort of trauma that eventually leads Elizabeth to be turned off to marriage. And those are just the two prevailing theories. There are others. The fact is we just simply don't know. She had an idiosyncratic way of looking at the subject, and all throughout her life and her reign, she would hear no conversation about either marriage or, towards the end of her life, who was going to be the successor after she left. Well, as you get into the early 1600s, during the last several years of Elizabeth's reign, there is something that historians call the English succession crisis, which is nothing else than just the problem of who's going to get the throne. And it came down to William Cecil, Lord Burleigh as he is known, Elizabeth's Secretary of State all throughout her reign, who managed to come up with the solution to the problem. The problem with the end of one dynasty is you have to go back in the genealogical charts and determine who has the best claim to the throne. And at times, it's not always clear. Well, William Cecil steps in, and he negotiates with the existing sitting king of Scotland, James. And to just go ahead and tell you the punchline now, it is James who eventually comes to be both king of Scotland and of England, which, by the way, is an indication as to why in textbooks and in all kinds of encyclopedias and dictionaries and things, he is known as James VI and the First. In Scotland, there had been 5 King James before him, so he was King James VI of Scotland. In England, there had not been a King James, so he is King James I. And if you have any Scottish friends and you refer to King James I, if they are good friends, they will tease you and remind you that he is actually King James VI of Scotland. Well, who was he? Well, James is descended in an oblique way to the Tudor dynasty. Henry VIII, the great king who started the English Reformation, had a sister Queen Margaret, who had been married up to the Scottish kingdom. And from Margaret, there had come the famous Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, Mary, Queen of Scots is one of the more peripatetic rulers and leaders of the Catholic movement during this time. We saw her, for example, down in the French regions during the early days of the Huguenots. She was married to a French king and lived for a number of years down there. After his death, she is returned to Scotland, hence the name Mary, Queen of Scots. And when she's returned, she marries a man by the name of Henry Stuart. Henry Stuart is also known as Lord Darnley. Now, it's important to note here, everyone refers to him generally as Darnley, or as Lord Darnley. But that's his title, that's not his name. His name is Henry Stuart. And that is where we get the name, the Stuart dynasty. Darnley, Lord Darnley, is by birth Henry Stuart. Mary and Lord Darnley had a child. They had James. Mary, though, in particular, was a committed Catholic. All throughout her reigns, both when she was in France and now that she was back in Scotland, she wanted nothing to do with the Reformation. She was very much like the early Tudors before Henry VIII, who resisted the changes brought about by the Protestants. In Scotland, though, particularly with the work of John Knox, after he had been banned from England by Elizabeth, went up to Scotland and, along with a number of others, began to really make a lot of headway with a grassroots Protestant movement there in Scotland. Mary always resisted it. There are a number of cases of Knox preaching before the Queen or of speaking harshly to her because he found her religion so repugnant. This says a little bit about Knox's personality. He's a bit like William Farel, the man who cajoled Calvin to stay in Geneva and who often spoke with the harsh side of his tongue. Knox was a man of conviction, and if he had the floor, if he had the pulpit, he would let his position be known. The complexities, though, in Scotland are that the noble houses and the pastors in particular generally were unfavorable to Mary, whether they saw her as an outsider having come back from France, or whether it was religious, her being Catholic and them being Protestant. It's not always black and white. Some fall one way, some fall the other. Some embrace both problems when they speak ill of Mary. Well, in general, they really had no recourse to get rid of Mary. Overthrowing a queen and starting over was just simply not done in these days. This is not the revolutionary era. As soon as you overthrow the queen, you're going to simply plunge your country into chaos and ruin, and nothing galvanizes the nobility quite like having the populace overthrow one of their own. And we'll see this when we get to the English Civil War. At times, people side with a monarch who's being overthrown simply because they don't want to see monarchs overthrown, even if the guy or the gal who hold the post is not their favorite person. Well, the problem, though, is that Mary and her husband, Darnley, don't really have a good relationship. In fact, it's very much on rocky soil. There are all kinds of jealousies, tempers flare, and it comes to a head in 1566 when Darnley arranges for the murder of Mary's secretary, sort of her right-hand man, a man by the name of Rizzio, when he is stabbed to death in front of Mary when she is pregnant with James. Whether or not this was the crack in the armor or not, it's not always clear, but it does seem to be the case that Mary had, by the end, had enough of the man. She gave birth to James, and there arose a plot between her and another man within the noble houses to have Darnley killed so that Mary could run off with him. And the infamous moment happens at a place called Kirk o' the Field. And piecing this together, again, is a bit of a challenge, but it does seem to be the case that Darnley is killed, and above and beyond that, there is rigged some kind of an explosion meant to disguise the fact that Darnley had been actually assassinated. Mary actually runs off with the man who is alleged to have done this, and to make matters worse, she up and marries him 3 months later. The stench of this is that it seems as if Mary has killed her husband and run off with the murderer. And all kinds of people throughout Europe, in particular in England, William Cecil and Elizabeth down there, take a great deal of interest in this, and they're trying to determine what happened. They are trying to make sure that Mary isn't framed, but they're also really suspicious of the circumstances of the death of Darnley. Well, eventually the Scottish nobility put Mary under arrest, and Mary spends a number of years in prison, and she never sees her son James again. At this point, he was just a young baby. Now, the story of Mary, Queen of Scots will carry on. She will spend some years in prison there in Scotland. She will eventually escape and flee to England, which is, she thinks, a smart thing to do. But she is now a renegade Catholic queen who is a known murderer, or at least an alleged murderer, and she is quickly placed under arrest in England. For a number of years, Elizabeth has to try to figure out what they're going to do with her. Again, the idea of executing a monarch for even serious crimes is just not done in this day and age. They had never had a situation that was bad enough that law could be applied to a monarch. Again, in this day, by and large, it's not that they believed that the monarch was above the law, it's just that they believed that the accountability of the law was not to be meted out on a monarch in this lifetime. It was said repeatedly that a monarch will answer to God and to God alone. So don't believe here that when there's any hesitation to overthrow or to execute a monarch for, say, treason or for murder, that they get a free ride. According to the theological position of the day, they're going to get theirs, but the problem is they would rather keep the semblance of order, and if a tyrant is on the throne, the only thing the populace can really do is pray them out, pray for the death, and pray for the next king or queen to be better. Well, Elizabeth herself has to go through this rather torturous experience. Eventually, though, Mary gets involved with some sort of an uprising. She seems to have played her cards with some Catholics there in England who wanted to get rid of Elizabeth and perhaps put Mary on the throne there to reestablish Catholicism. At least this is what is alleged. The plot is found out, even if it was not really going to be executed or attempted in any way. And as a result, Mary, Queen of Scots, at a very old age, is eventually beheaded. So this is a strange deal with James. He is descended from a very, very Catholic line. He is, again, obliquely related to the Tudors, but he is, from a very young age, before his memory, separated from his mother and raised and tutored there as the young prince, the future king, as a Protestant. He is more or less, you might say, without too much hyperbole, raised and tutored by the church itself. Knox and the nobility who were Protestant made very certain that James had the best of the best Protestant tutors from the Presbyterian Church of Scotland to raise him to not be like his mother, Buchanan in particular. He is a notable scholar and a humanist. Buchanan literally tries to whip out the Catholicism from James. You might say that they attempt to do a bit of an experiment to see if they can raise a king on Protestant principles and on humility, and if he might turn out to be better than the typical tyrant that kings and queens were, at least not infrequently, known to become. Buchanan is harsh. He liked to use corporal punishment, which was not uncommon in this day and age for pedagogical purposes. And he liked to drill into James deep, rich biblical thinking, and, he attempted at least, to make him understand that he is answerable to the people, that he is not a standalone sovereign. Now, that second piece never actually ingrains itself into James. In fact, as we'll see as we go through this, James actually begins to become a writer himself, and his own personal convictions are that a king is, as we like to say, subject to a divine right, that he has the right to be above law, so that the citizens and the parliaments throughout various nations don't believe that they can simply call the king or queen before them and slap him on the wrist whenever they want. In James' mind, and in the minds of many people in this day and age, that sounds like chaos. That sounds like sort of a mosh pit of all these different groups, always sort of pulling the king or queen back and forth. But still, James actually is Protestant. In a manner of speaking, because of the problems with his mother, with Mary, Queen of Scots, James is ripped from this strong Catholic legacy from within his dynasty. And to the day he dies, he sees himself as a committed Protestant. That is typically underappreciated. Too often it's said that James only cares about his own authority and that he really doesn't care all that much for Puritanism or for Anglicanism, as we'll see in a bit. That's actually not the case. James is just simply like Henry VIII or like Elizabeth or Mary or frankly any of the monarchs from this day and age, not willing to let the inmates run the asylum. He's going to have pretty strong convictions about theology. and he's going to be a pretty committed Protestant. He's going to be committed to the Bible. But what he will not put up with are those who run around telling him what to do. Just write it down as ironclad. In this day and age, anytime you tell a king or a queen what to do, you can pretty much guarantee they're either not going to do it or they're going to do the opposite. So in 1603, after this rich upbringing and education, James is appointed to be king of both Scotland, and now he is going to be king of England, taking over from Elizabeth. Now, James very much wanted this. England, he said, was an upgrade. He actually makes an analogy. He said, I was sleeping with a rock for my pillow, and now I have a feathered bed, now that he's moved to England. He tells them that he'll be back in 2 or 3 years after he has established himself as King of England, but he never once again sets foot back on Scottish soil. The takeover of the English throne, though, by James unites the kingdoms of Scotland and England in a very real way for, honestly, the first time. There had always been claims back and forth, particularly by the English, that they owned Scotland. Just see the movie Braveheart if you want to see some of this in fictional action. And throughout the Middle Ages, there were times where Scotland was under the thumb of the English kings, but they always resisted it, and frankly, they still do today. They do not want to be vassals or subordinates to the English. Even if they are one, they want to be separate but equal, you might say. James' policy all throughout his reign and the policy of his son Charles is to attempt to make sure that this union between the two crowns sticks. That the Tudor dynasty, now taken over by the Stuart, blends, at least to the extent that it can, with the Scottish heritage and its ethos. So that's the political background. James comes to England. What's James' role, though, in terms of theology in the church? Well, it's pretty significant. When James is literally on the road, you might say, heading down to England to take over the throne, he is met along the way by a group that we would later call Puritan, a disgruntled band of pastors within the Church of England who put in James' hand something that is today known as the Millenary Petition. Now, it's called the Millenary Petition because it is alleged to have 1,000 signatures upon it. Mille in Latin is the word for 1,000. And the Millenary Petition was, again, it's a more or less Puritan document. It's laying before James the things that those who were disgruntled with the Anglican Church hoped to see reform on. Over the course of Elizabeth's reign, a lot of these folks felt very stifled. A number of their concerns were ticky-tack, let's just be honest. And you'll see this here in this petition. But what is happening is those who are conformist, and given the tone of the Elizabethan and Anglican heritage that we saw in a previous lecture, those who had small criticisms of change, because they feel stifled, they eventually begin to create more, and the problems fester because they're not given the opportunity to be aired out and for the grievances to be at least somewhat respected. It's only human, in fact. You have one criticism, no one wants to listen to it, and suddenly you go, well, I have 7 more now. I have all these other ones now to add to that original one. It's a bit like that. By this point, in 1603, the unhappy Puritans there within the English church have a number of things that they hope to see change on. Now, perhaps the best way to see this before I give you some of these elements that they hope to change is that these are proxy wars. A proxy war, you might know from modern politics, is whenever 2 behemoth countries want to go to war, but they don't really want to go into total war against one another, will often meet on a smaller playing field or over a smaller matter and try to support different sides. Just see, by the way, the Korean War or the Vietnam War as an example of this. Vietnam was not just about Vietnam, it was about communism from places like China going up against American capitalism. There they were meeting face-to-face on this turf war. So a proxy war is whenever there's something big, some elephant in the room, but they start to fight about sub-things or small things on the side. Another analogy is whenever you see a married couple fighting about the dishes, they're not just fighting about the dishes, they're fighting about something else more fundamental. It's just the dishes are the thing that they're expressing that frustration through. That's really more where the Puritans are coming from. They're coming more from a position of being concerned that no one really wants to talk about, are we living biblically in the context of our worship? Or are we just simply embracing and affirming traditions simply because we like them? Why aren't we being more careful, and why do we have things that seem to be traditional medieval Catholic if there's not a principled reason for embracing them? And so lots of things begin to fester. So the millenary petition lists a number of things that they want to see changed. They don't like, for example, the making of the sign of the cross on the infant during baptism. This is seen, they believe, as superstitious. Some of the medieval view that baptism is some kind of talisman that de facto brings the Holy Spirit into the baby. Like those under Elizabeth, they call not for the end of vestments, but for them to be made optional, that those who have a conscience against it can opt not to wear them. Elizabeth, of course, had always said, nope, put them on. They also don't want wedding rings. This is a bit of a strange one, but they found that the use of a wedding ring for marriage was, at least they allege, superstitious. Why do I need a band around my finger of some precious metal that tells me that my marriage is somehow signed and sealed by God? That's superstition, they said. The other one, which I always get a chuckle at, they were pretty concerned about the observance of Sabbath. Now, again, this is a proxy war. They're concerned about why people aren't willing to talk about what we do and don't do on Sabbath. Everyone in this day, of course, embraced the idea that you're not supposed to work, you're supposed to rest. Well, there was a long-standing habit in the English culture that you could go out into the parks or into public spaces or even at your home and you could play games. You could have festivities, you could go out and do things like go bowling, at least an earlier version of it, and so on and so forth. A lot of what's in play here, though, is not so much the concern about play and recreation, but it's, again, a real commitment to the question of, are we following the Bible? Now, lots of people cluck their tongue and eye-roll this. Even in their own day, the Puritans were being made fun of for this. James the First himself, in fact, in a later year, will write a book, a very famous book called The Book of Sports, of all things, in which he lists, in a somewhat conciliatory way, the types of activities you can do on Sabbath and the kinds you can't. So he allows for festivities or festivals, maypoles, and these types of fun events to go on Sabbath. But interestingly enough, James takes the Puritan side and he outlaws bowling on Sunday. You might say that the millenary petition, when laid before James, was asking for a pound when it should have taken an ounce. It was sort of spewing all of these problems onto James with the assumption, the wrong assumption they're going to find out, that James will see their side on this. Well, James does call a meeting. It's called the Hampton Court Conference from 1604, in which he brings together the leaders from the church, from the Anglican Church, and these disgruntled folks from within the church as well, who had given him the millenary petition. And James' demeanor and his engagement here at this conference is really a masterstroke. It shows that he is a good king and he was trained well. James more or less keeps them both off balance. On the one hand, he excoriates the Puritans for their ticky-tack, needless complaints about all kinds of different things. He, in other words, tells them that they are asking for too much. They're complaining about everything when they should have found the root cause of a couple of things that they found to be abhorrent. Well, the church leadership on the other side of the aisle began to sort of stroke their peacock feathers and feel that they had won the day, at which point James turns on them and blasts them for not hearing their brethren, not being concerned for good order or good worship, and for simply sticking it to the Puritans all of these years. This is good leadership, probably good parenting, by the way. You have two siblings fighting within the same household. Both are probably wrong here. There's not one who is the saintly one and one who is the annoying, complaining one. And so he churns on both of them, but he also affirms both of them in a fundamental way. What James does, though, is, again, a masterstroke. He notices that the Bible in English had not been updated or really given much attention throughout Elizabeth's reign. There had been a translation called the Bishop's Bible, but it was more or less a dusted-up version of an earlier 16th century version of the Bible in English. James, realizing that both are committed Protestants and both are committed to the Bible, churns and instructs both of them to work together and to translate and produce what would eventually become known as the authorized version of the Bible. In the American context, it's sometimes called the King James Bible. In its original, it was called the Authorized Bible because it had been authorized by the government. No one called it the King James Bible. Again, this is a masterstroke. He puts them both to work on something they're concerned about, and it gets them off of the problems that they're all squabbling about. From 1604 to 1611, they devote themselves to translating the Bible back from the originals into a new, you might say, a Shakespearean-influenced English. The other thing that James demands is that there be nothing in the Bible except the text itself. No comments, no liturgy, nothing. Let the Word of God stand on its own, he argued. And so if you ever see editions of the Authorized Bible from this day and age, it's very, very majestic, the translation, but it's also clean. There are no comments or theologies woven within it. And here's the thing. So many folks all throughout the centuries have been KJV only. They've had a sort of superstitious view of the King James Bible. But don't let that cloud our view of the Authorized Bible. It really is a masterpiece. Its translational value in its own day is staggering. Even if it sounds archaic and old to us today, when you go and read the original King James Bible, still it is in its own day, again, something like Shakespeare putting the English language on display as a vehicle for translating the Bible. As one historian once put it, the Authorized Bible gave God an English accent. And for a number of years and for a number of centuries, actually, it is widely read and used as the English text for anyone who's going to be a Christian in the context of the English world. It's even, by the way, used by those who break apart from the English church and go their own way denominationally. It's just that important. In some ways, the KJV only folks got going because when new texts, new manuscripts, in particular new Greek manuscripts, were discovered that helped us correct and polish up and get rid of certain verses that were mistranslated in the KJV, it had stood the test for so long that it felt as if people were tinkering with the real Bible itself. And so while I don't believe in the KJV-only mythology about its origin or about the Textus Receptus, a lot of what's driving this culturally is this belief that this is the best translation to use. And for a number of years it was. One last thing, though, that happened under James that really galvanized all these disparate parts for a time was the gunpowder plot of 1605. Some of you have probably heard the slogan, "Remember, remember the 5th of November." Well, that comes directly from the gunpowder plot. The story is a man by the name of Guy Fawkes, as well as a number of others, were Roman Catholics who were disgruntled and angry at the loss of the Catholic witness in England because of the Tudors. And in this day and age, you could rent space beneath Parliament, these storage chambers, and he does this, and the plot was that they would roll these barrels of gunpowder down there beneath Parliament. And the idea was that with the calling of a Parliament at some point in 1605, as well as the convocation across the street with Westminster Abbey, that they would simply blow up Parliament. Now, the amount of gunpowder he puts down there in the storage area, and just simply the physics of it, the fact that you're putting a massive amount of combustible material beneath a building, needs to be appreciated. Historians have actually done computer models as to what would have happened if the plot had been carried out. And essentially, blowing up Parliament would have made all the fragments and the debris from Parliament something like a shotgun. All these pieces of stone would have flown all throughout what is now downtown London, and a widespread amount would have been destroyed entirely. Now, Guy Fawkes in the plot is discovered almost really at the last moment. And he and his entourage of folks who were plotting this, of course, were executed in the worst possible way. But above and beyond this, the Guy Fawkes conspiracy, the gunpowder plot, galvanized all the Protestants who were fighting amongst themselves, because now there was this mutual enemy of this really suspicious Catholicism that they now believed were terrorists, you might say, in their midst. For a number of years, in fact, James rules for another 20 years after the gunpowder plot, it is a relatively peaceful reign. He has the church and those who are squabbling within the church, the leadership, working themselves towards this new translation. And he does a fair amount of back and forth and a balancing act between both sides. And now that they have a mutual enemy in this rogue terrorist Catholicism, at least that's how they see it, there is relative peace. Well, James dies in 1625, and onto the throne comes his son Charles. And if James' rule was a masterstroke of leadership and balance between opposing sides, Charles has, let's just say it, none of his father's charm or his wit. And Charles I, as we'll see in our next lecture, almost single-handedly creates the context that launches the English Civil War.